Hello. Welcome to my talk introducing Terra Draw, a JavaScript library to draw on any web map. It's great to be here. It's great to be back at FOSS4G. I think the last time I was at FOSS4G was in Boston in 2017, I think it was. So it's been a little while, so it's nice to be back in person. I've got a lot to get through, so I might skip through these slides quite quickly, but there'll be a link and a PDF available afterwards with all the content. So, a bit about me. My name is James. I'm a software developer, a web developer specifically. I've been kind of working in web and geospatial for probably about 10 years. I occasionally in my spare time, I'm also working on Turf.js, which some of you may be familiar with. And I'm also a Google developer expert for web technologies. So I have to give a shout out to my current company that I work for, Nearform, where they're a web app consultancy, and they have a lot of history in the open source community, specifically in kind of the JavaScript and Node ecosystems. They allowed me to come here and kind of, made it possible for me to be here. So shout out to them. What is the problem that Terra Draw is trying to solve? So I just want to give a bit of context around the space in which Terra Draw is working in and what kind of problem it tries to solve. So the examples that I've kind of put up here come from a range of different places. One example you might have seen of like where you may need to like draw on a map is if you've ever used something like Zoopla or Rightmove, which are in the UK. I don't know if they also exist in other places, but essentially like it's a tool that allows you to find places to buy or rent properties. And both these tools have, or both these websites have a tool that allows you to draw like an area of interest that you want to see properties in. And it will only return properties like within that polygon that you draw out. And I also put another couple of examples here of like some map builder tools. One's from like National Geographic and another one's from Waze, and they have like Waze have kind of a tool for, I guess, updating their like map data or areas of interest or various other aspects of like geographic data that they maintain. And for me, my background in this kind of problem was that I was working for a startup that was doing indoor mapping and indoor positioning, specifically in kind of the retail spaces. So I was working for a long time, like trying to figure out like how we could build a tool that allowed to quickly map like indoor spaces. And whilst I was doing that, there was like I managed to evaluate like a few different options of tools that kind of somewhat did this to some extent. In varying degrees of features and maintenance and all these kind of different things. Eventually landed on MapGL Draw, so spent a lot of time working with MapGL Draw, which is essentially like a plugin library for MapboxGL. So I got to know that kind of reasonably well, and I eventually kind of. I left the company I was working at. It was called Dent Reality at the time. It's now called HyperAR in, I think, June last year, and took some time out. And during that time, I was thinking about like that problem of like drawing on maps and like kind of. I had a few frustrations that I'd had just from like using these other these other libraries, and I kind of was thinking, I wonder if there's a way that I could kind of approach this maybe a bit differently, or kind of could kind of fill some of those holes or fill some of the requirements that I felt were missing when I was working with those tools. And I started, I think in like late June or maybe early July last year, and trying to prototype some of this. And one of the things that I was thinking about was like the actual I wasn't fully convinced that much of the drawing logic needed to be coupled with the actual mapping library that you use, because the interactions that you have with like a map are actually, there aren't that many, and most mapping libraries have very, very similar APIs. So I had this idea that we could basically like just have this very thin, like what I would call like an adapter layer that would exist for each mapping library, which is like maybe like a 100 or 200 lines of code that just maps methods onto the underlying library, and then everything else, the core, would just be universal for all of the different adapters, basically. So I started messing around with that, and yeah, I was like, oh, this actually works. Like you can actually do this, and it kind of functions as in a way that you might expect. And so the aims that I was trying to get at with the library was that again, I wanted to kind of get away. I wanted to try and solve some of the problems that I felt like I had faced whilst I was using other tools previously. And so one of the things I really wanted to make it was extensible. So I wanted it to be able to have really customized modes that you could create on top of or plug into basically Terra Draw. So basically Terra Draw comes with a bunch of predefined modes like point, line, polygon, which I'll show in a little bit, but also I wanted you to be able to say actually I have these really niche specific requirements and I need to make a mode that's really specific for the problem space that I'm working in. The other thing is cross-library support, which I talked about briefly in the last slide, so that it can work with any kind of in theory any kind of mapping library. And the last thing was just wanting to be able to have styling control. So one of the frustrations I had previously was not being able to actually fully style all of the geometries that were being rendered on the map as you were drawing. So I just wanted to be able to make sure that that was really possible. And so since then, Terra Draw has had I think 36 version releases on npm over the last I guess probably just over a year. And yeah, there's been some cool bits, I guess. Things that have come out recently that I think have been quite nice additions have been things like mobile and tablet support, so touch support, and getting that behaving uniformly across different devices and also different mapping libraries, and that's a really interesting problem to try and solve. And also added in a bunch of different core modes, so things like rectangle mode, so you can draw a rectangle, or freehand mode, so you can draw a freehand polygon. Yeah, there's all kinds of stuff that's come along in the last year, which I think has been a nice addition to the library. So I'll show you a few examples of Terra Draw in action. These kind of work better as videos, but just because they wanted these to be able to come out as PDFs, I've just kind of broken this down into images. But this is just an example of the polygon drawing mode. So it's reasonably straightforward. You start by drawing a point and then another point, and that creates a line. And then you create this third point. You can move the mouse on the third point, and it will, once you create the third point, you can then close the polygon. By clicking either the start or the end of the polygon, which are those 2 points. And then finally, once you click on one of the closing points, it will create the polygon. And there's lots of interesting things around the UX of actually creating, of how you actually do drawing is really interesting. And it was interesting seeing how different drawing tools had implemented that. And do I copy them, or do I do my own thing, or do I just do what makes sense? You kind of landed somewhere in the middle based on just oh well, actually I like this aspect of this drawing library and this aspect of this drawing library, and maybe I can create something that's kind of somewhere in between. So alongside the drawing tools, there's also selection tools and actual ability to edit geometries you've already created. So this is an example of the select mode. So here I have the polygon selected, and in the second image I'm inserting. You can insert a point in one of the midpoints. So you see how here this point's slightly smaller. If you click on that, it inserts a point into the polygon, and then you can actually edit and move that point that you've created as well and drag it around. Selection mode. And this comes onto the styling side of things. So as I was saying, I wanted to be able to have the decent ability to kind of style what was being rendered to the map. And so again, this kind of works a little bit better as a video, but what was happening here is basically as I was moving the mouse, it was updating the color of the polygons on the fly. And you can style each mode and each geometry individually as well. So you have a lot of control over what actually is being rendered to the map, and you can do all of that. You can change that styling kind of as you want. So as part of like setting up the project, I created a website for the project called terradraw.io, and that kind of acts as a test bed and ability to just show off like kind of some of the things that TerraDraw can do. It's quite similar to if you've used something like geojson.io. It has a similar level of kind of functionality. You can get out the GeoJSON that's being created in the right-hand panel. But yeah, and that kind of, it has all of the modes on there. I think apart from maybe it's missing like rectangle mode at the moment, I think, but I think all the other ones are, all the built-in modes are also on there. So yeah, check that out if you just want to have a play, or do you just want to see what I'm talking about in real life. So a bit of a technical overview, going into kind of some of the technical details of the project. So the whole library is written in TypeScript, so I'm a big TypeScript fan. I feel like it adds a lot of benefits, and I guess one of the big benefits I think in relation to this project is around like it makes it, or I feel like it makes it easier to make things extensible in the sense like, so there's like an abstract class for an adapter and an abstract class for a mode, and then you just extend that and just fill in the methods that are missing, and that creates your mode or your adapter basically. And I think that TypeScript really lends itself to being able to do that sensibly. It's also all test as in Jest. It's just personal preference based on historically I've just used Jest a lot. So Jest is like a JavaScript testing framework basically. And so one of the other things about this as well that I think is quite cool, minus the kind of development dependencies for like testing and spinning up like local, like building the project and so forth, the actual library itself doesn't have any dependencies. So it was kind of just an architectural choice that historically I've just been fed up with things like breaking upstream because people don't respect like semantic versioning, or also just things like not building for some bizarre reason because some npm package is like stopped working for some reason. So I was just like, okay, let's just try and see if there's a way to do this without having any other external dependencies basically. So this is kind of an overview of the, I guess, architecture of TerraDraw. In a way, it's quite simple. It's kind of, I guess, maybe what they would call like an onion architecture, where there's kind of layers. So the first layer, I guess, is like the adapter layer. So you pick an adapter that you want to use. So whether it be Mapbox, Leaflet, or Google, or whatever, whichever one you're interested in using, and then you also decide which modes you want to use. So maybe I want to use Mapbox and I just want the polygon mode. And then at the core, there's like the core, which is where all the geometry is stored. And that JSON, and there's like a bit of sort of space up kind of when you do selections and this kind of thing. But essentially that's it. Like it's a relatively like simple architecture. There's not a lot going on. Which are the way we get this cross-library compatibility. So maybe the common questions like how does that work? And the real answer is like there's only really like a finite number of ways to really interact with a web map. And so as long as you can capture all of those events and then basically
can you not hold your door near the antenna thingy?
this? Okay. Sorry, didn't realize. Yeah, so there's only a finite number of ways you can really interact with like a web map. So as long as you can capture all of those events and then kind of just like proxy them to the underlying library, you only need like a relatively thin layer to actually like capture those events. And you also need to handle like rendering to the map, and that's a little bit of work, but realistically compared to the rest of the library, it's quite a small amount of code. And so there's adapters for OpenLayers, Google Maps, Leaflet, MapLibre, and MapboxGL.js. Quite lucky at the moment because MapLibre and MapboxGL.js have the same interface, so you don't have to do anything different.
We're working on that.
Okay. Well, the nice thing is that they are separated. So, like in theory, like if the compatibility changes, then it's like you can just edit you can edit them individually, and that's fine, right? Yeah. So potentially there's opportunities to support other. These are just the core ones that sprang to mind that I ended up writing, but there's no reason why you couldn't add in a different provider. So these are the things that you need to fulfill to be able to have an adapter for a drawing library. So project, and I always get confused about which way around it is. So project is where you go from like a geographic coordinate to a screen space coordinate, and then unproject is basically the inverse of that. And then set cursor, if you want to change the cursor styling, disabling double click to zoom. Sometimes we need to do that just because we have our own behaviors that we need to basically overwrite, like whatever's going on the map, so you don't accidentally just zoom in when you're trying to draw, basically. Get the map container, so just that you can get the underlying HTML element where the map's being rendered. And yeah, the others are not. The only other really interesting one is render, which is how you actually take the geometries that are inside Terra Draw and you render them. You basically update the layers in the mapping library to put them on the map. So yeah, you could do like, if you wanted to, we could write another adapter for, I don't know, like Apple Maps kit or some other, maybe like Cesium. Although that gets slightly more complicated when you start to do things in 3D. Okay, how do you use Terra Draw? So what I would recommend is using just npm, Node Package Manager, and you can just do npm install Terra Draw, and it will install it into your project. If you want to just use it in a drop-in HTML file, there's a UMD bundle, so you can just drop it into like an HTML page and use like a script tag as well, if that's how you want to do things. And here's an example of like how you would use Terra Draw with MapLibre. So the first, I guess, 13 lines is just the first 1 to 6 is just imports, and then 8 to 13 is setting up the map, and then we wait for the map to load, and then line 16 to 24 is where the actual Terra Draw instance is created. So line 16, we create Terra Draw. We pass in an adapter for MapLibre. We give the adapter the map object, and then the mode, and then we just provide it the modes that we're interested in. So here we're just providing the polygon drawing mode, but you could also pass in, point, line, select, all the other modes if you wanted to. And then eventually we just start Terra Draw basically, so that it can start receiving events. Docs, I've done my best to try and make sure that there's a reasonable level of documentation. So there's all the kind of common stuff you would hopefully expect in an open source project, like a README, changelog, license, code of conduct, all that good stuff. And then there's also some auto-generated API docs, which, this is also one of the benefits of TypeScript, is if you write doc comments in your code, then it can auto-generate all the API documentation for you using a library called tsdoc. And there's also a couple guides. So there's one for getting started, and there's another for if you want to actually work on developing Terra Draw itself or extending Terra Draw, then there's another guide for how you do that. Custom mode. So I talked a bit about I wanted to make Terra Draw really extensible, and part of that is if people want to just create their own mode, then that should be possible. So the way in which you do that is you import something called Terra Draw Extend, and that has a class on it called Terra Draw based draw mode, very Java. And you can extend that with your custom mode, and then as long as you just fulfill the interface of the draw mode, you can just do whatever it is that you want in there, and provide it some custom styling to to render whatever geometries it is that you are creating in that mode. So a couple of examples of that that came together. One was one of my friends wanted to basically create a mode where you could do client-side routing, so you could click a point on the map and then click another point on the map, and it would generate like a network route through locally in the browser through that route network, and then you could do that multiple times and have like a multi-stop routing like in the browser. This actually looks a lot cooler again on video because it's all happening kind of in real time as you move the mouse, but hopefully you can kind of imagine what that looks like. Another mode that I kind of just created just to demonstrate another approach or another way in which you could take it is if you're familiar with Segment Anything, which is I guess, machine learning model from Meta or Facebook that essentially allows you to segment images, so essentially pick out objects or features from an image. And some of you may have seen this with like people have taken this to like satellite imagery, and essentially I just created a mode that wraps around that model, and you can click on the map and it will generate you like a polygon vector of whatever it is that you clicked on, so a building or I don't know, a car park or a garage or whatever it might be. So yeah, just trying to demonstrate like you could kind of take these modes anywhere and they could kind of do whatever it is that you're wanting to do. So the future. So the roadmap is like, you know, relatively open-ended in the sense of I'm just trying to get a feel for like what people want to do with it and where they want to take it. I've had some feedback around like selection and like wanting to tweak that slightly, so that's something that I'm going to be looking at, is kind of improving the UX of the selection mode. But then also potentially adding a few more sort of like convenience methods to the public API. Potentially looking at like if you know there's things like I want to know what features are under my cursor at this point in time, and being able to do that like from the public interface of like a Terra Draw instance. Also potentially things like maybe like undo, redo, and kind of being able to control like if I draw something, I want to be able to undo drawing it or fast forward or you know whatever it might be. And then lastly is just trying to maybe like looking at solidifying the public interface a bit more and just kind of looking at maybe releasing like a version 1. So it's currently, Terra Draw is currently, I guess, in alpha, but I think that's a bit of a misnomer. It's more just that I didn't want to be tied to having to, every time you update the public interface, like in theory you should have to bump the major version number, but I didn't want it to be just like bumping it like every week because I'm just making some random change, like some, not random, but like making a change to the library. So yeah, hopefully looking at kind of maybe solidifying that and making it like looking at releasing like a version 1 that's a bit more stable in terms of the interface. But yeah, if you're interested in helping out, then yeah, take a look on GitHub, maybe give it a star if you find it interesting. Feel free to would appreciate kind of testing it out and any feedback. And that doesn't necessarily even mean having to test it out at like a code level, but even if you just go on terradraw.io and something feels like a bit strange or like the UX feels a bit weird, then please feel free to make an issue or I guess even just come chat to me today. Yeah, pull requests obviously are welcome if you have improvements and yeah, on you know, whatever that might be, even if it's just fixing a typo in the README or whatever. I'm open to things of, you know, all sorts of contributions. Yeah, just come chat to me if you have interesting use cases or things that you would want to do, and I can maybe help, understand if that's possible, like how you might do that. Yeah, thanks.